I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange.
Hey there, spooky nerds, and welcome back to Talking Strange, the paranormal pop culture show. I'm Aaron Sagers, and the question today is: did the plot to assassinate John F. Kennedy begin in Dallas, or rather in the Florida Keys? That's the question today because we are talking about the new book, How Key West Killed JFK, the island that changed the course of history. And my guest is author David L. Sloan, a good friend of the show, a good friend of mine personally, and an accomplished author who, in this book, uncovers astonishing new evidence linking Key West to the events that culminated in the president's death. Now, throughout the book, Sloan draws on personal interviews and declassified FBI and CIA documents. He exposes connections between Cuban exiles, mafia figures, intelligence operatives who moved through the island's hidden networks during the Cold War, and also looks at rumors of Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby being together at the Key West airport to CIA plots hatched in Marathon Key and No Name Key. All the book all together just pieces together a really incredible, chilling mosaic of power moves, a betrayal, a conspiracy that converged on America's southernmost city. And then we're going to get to a man that very well may be at the heart of this story, a quiet Key West baker that had some secrets to him. A little bit more about Sloan. For more than 30 years, David Sloan's lived in Key West. He's been documenting history, folklore. He's a researcher, a cold case investigator, and an author of more than 25 books. And he doesn't just tell stories, he unearths the strange, the unusual, the hidden secrets of Key West and the Florida Keys. And in addition to now JFK, he is known for talking about the and popularizing the legacy of Robert the Doll and exploring the true history of key lime pie and uh and a whole lot of other great and weird topics. So without further ado, David Sloan. Hey man.
Hey,
I I
thanks
I
for the
forgot
introduction.
I forgot to mention, I did text you and tell you this, that in my own research, JFK research, I discovered that uh, John F. Kennedy was a big fan of daiquiris, and Jackie had her own special daiquiri recipe for JFK. Well, in honor of today's appearance, I made this daiquiri with key limes, so it's a JFK and KW daiquiri.
I think that's incredible because when you sent me the information about him, that was so cool because I'd never heard that. And I started looking it up and seeing how he loved to make it with limes. And I thought, oh, key limes would be perfect. I've got to try.
Limeade concentrate, in fact, is like Jackie's secret sauce for that. And yeah, I went down a whole cocktail historian kind of adventure looking this up. And it's also, you have to appreciate the irony that JFK's favorite drink is also a Cuban cocktail. So it seems like very much his life, his adult life, anyhow, was wrapped up in Cuba.
Yeah. And they say that he liked his daiquiris the same way that Hemingway did. So, it's probably something that would have been drinking in Key West.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh, like Key West is really the intersection of so many people, and I guess yeah, let's get into that a little bit. Actually, I mean, you've lived in Key West for 30 years at this point, right?
Mhm.
And what was your interest connection to JFK outside of researching this book? Like, does he kind of hold an outsized legacy for you? Have you already previously been interested in JFK?
Well, it's interesting because I think everybody has this interest in JFK and the assassination. But when I was about 12 years old, I moved to Dallas. My family was transferred there. So I grew up about 15 miles away from where the assassination took place. And so it was something that weighed a little heavier in Dallas, perhaps, than other places in the country. I used to buy my school supplies at the Sun Rexall where Marina Oswald worked. So, I mean, we were close to it. But I never had that fascination. I never considered myself a JFK researcher. But in Key West, I always liked looking for the mysteries, long-standing legends that I could take somewhere and prove. And I was looking for a missing fire chief who's pretty much the Jimmy Hoffa of Key West. And you already know about him, but for those who don't, his name is Bum Fardo. And people laugh at the name, but his case is very interesting because he was convicted of selling cocaine when he was the fire chief. And when he was convicted before sentencing, he disappeared. And nobody knows what happened to him. And
Hmm.
this month, February 16th, will be the 50-year anniversary of his disappearance. And so back in 2018 maybe, uh, somebody sent me the FBI files with information about Bumfardo. And a friend and I decided to track him down and find out what the truth was. But as we went through these files and started going through the declassified CIA files, a lot of these people were in the Kennedy assassination reports. And the first thing that I saw was that Jack Ruby was selling guns out of an Isla Morada hotel room. And when I saw this, I look and I'm like, wait, the guy who shot Lee Harvey Oswald? No way. And then there's a report of Lee Harvey Oswald fueling up his boat at a house in Marathon and using the phone there to call Jack Ruby. And I think, no, nonsense. There's no way that happened. But then there's another report of him fueling up his boat in Stock Island. And I recognized some of the names in that report. And the one that blew me away, the airport director, there was an extensive interview done with him where he talked about Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby together in the Key West airport as part of the Fair Play for Cuba committee traveling to Cuba. Now, the airport director, George Feraldo, the street going by the airport's named after him. He's not a crackpot. The interviews even state that he's a very sane man. So it says that he had a photograph of the two of them together, and he had passed away. But I called his wife, Norma, and I said, "Have you ever heard about this?" And you know what Norma said? She said, "Yeah, I've still got that photo somewhere." And I asked her, could we come look for it? And she said, "Yeah, I'm a little sick right now, but when I get better, I'd be happy to show it to you." And she passed away before we had that opportunity, not under strange circumstances. But that made me know that, yeah, there was something to this. And I kind of switched gears away from Bumfardo and into the Kennedy thing. And it it revealed this really wild history of Key West that nobody's ever really talked about.
And I think it's worth noting that a lot of your books, I mean, the books that have kind of gained the most attention, obviously, you've tracked the origins of key lime pie, and then you've written about Key West and things to quit your job and move to Key West and the Key West bucket list. But you've also written a lot about the paranormal, about legends, about folklore. This seems like, even though you were already researching Bumfardo, this seems like a whole separate kind of skill set to investigate a murder, a crime, and all of these connections and tendrils. And we're also not talking about, let's face it, it's not ancient history, right? So what kind of like additional skills were required of you, or sort of a gear shift to pursue this particular book?
Well, I think it's interesting because in the paranormal field, a lot of these legends that we investigate are about people who died. So the crime aspect of it wasn't that strange because I've always enjoyed doing that with the stories in Key West, because a lot of them are just stories that have been told over and over again, and they kind of move away from what the actual facts are. So I've loved unearthing the stories that put these legends back together. I had a lot of help because my dad was a genealogist. Ever since I was a kid, he loved digging up history. And he was doing it when you used to go to the historical societies and when you'd write letters to people in Australia and try to get information that they had. So I grew up around that, even though I didn't have a huge interest, but he helped me a lot along the way. When I was researching the ghost things, he'd give me tips. When I was researching key lime pie, he told me, things to look for about how different names work, or looking for dates outside of where your subject was in different newspapers. So a lot of that came in handy. And then, just spending the hours and hours, because I prefer going through old newspapers to going through social media. It's almost like a time machine that transports you back. And I love kind of living in that time and trying to step into the mind of the people who were there, because you can read about something, but actually getting to that level where you understand them and can kind of think and act like them, it's a really cool place to be.
Yeah, and this is ultimately, this still feels like I think one of those fresh wounds in American history. I think because it is obviously it was such a violent act, and although I was not, it's kind of funny for me to think about. Like, no, I wasn't alive when he was assassinated. However, through the scope of history, like it wasn't that long, honestly, before I was born. And
Yeah.
my parents, grew up with this, so it it feels fresh from that perspective. And then you look at Key West. Key West is ultimately a small town. It's a small area. And even though there may have been a lot of people that have moved in since, there's a lot of people that were there in the 60s and 63. So give me a little bit of a sense of how this story, JFK and JFK's assassination, continues to live in Key West. It continues to be felt amongst the people that live there. Does it feel like it's still a kind of a present and ongoing story down there?
Well, I think it feels more so now. The people who are around then, they love sharing their stories about what happened at that time. And for a long time, people didn't feel comfortable talking because it's a small island. You don't want to say things about your neighbor or your friend that might end up getting you in trouble. And I think that's why this aspect was never spoken about. But also, a lot of people were working for the Tampa Mafia without realizing they were working for the Tampa Mafia. The way that the mafia worked its way into Key West, it started with Prohibition. And, the Florida Keys were this great, they were pretty much a pipeline for everything to come in from Cuba and from the Caribbean and then just go straight into America. And when liquor was doing it, people didn't think liquor was that bad of a thing. It had been legal before. And then after that, the illegal gambling came in the form of bolita, which is pretty much a Spanish lottery. It was a Cuban lottery. And when the Tampa Mafia took control of that, the people were buying tickets from their neighbors at the corner store. The people who were running the money back and forth, they were people that they grew up with. Even the bankers were people that they knew. So they didn't realize that all of this money was going to the Tampa Mafia to support larger operations that eventually led to the drugs and to the crime and all the other things that came with it. So it's interesting. And when people see how Key West killed JFK, a lot of people kind of laugh. They think it's a joke title. Somebody said, "Oh, that sounds like something that Carl Hyacin would write." And I say, "Well, thank you." But when I started looking into it, I wanted to write this strange Cold War history that unfolded in Key West because we're so close to Cuba. 90 miles from Cuba, we're closer to Cuba than we are to a Walmart. And when you had the CIA get involved, they set up the largest covert base in the world right at the gateway to the Keys. And we're talking a couple thousand agents. They were running about 15,000 paid Cuban exiles on their payroll, the third largest navy in the Caribbean. So they were running all these clandestine operations out of the Florida Keys. So you have Castro and the Soviets, the CIA, the Tampa Mafia, and then all these Cuban exiles who were being trained by the CIA to fight, and then working for the Tampa Mafia. And it became this really incredible game of cat and mouse that involved selling drugs to make money to buy guns to take over communist countries. Um,
Yeah. Oh, sorry, go on.
No, so you can imagine that was Kennedy being caught in the middle of all of that. He had a lot of powerful forces who didn't like him.
Yeah, I mean, basically everybody that you're mentioning right there all had their own reasons for for having a beef with JFK and wanting him out of the picture.
Yeah.
Uh, and yeah, it's also funny because I think maybe there's been maybe more attention placed on sort of organized crime in Florida and the Deep South, but it'd be easy for people to think, well, this is just sort of this is largely a Northeast, Midwest, big city kind of situation. But you're talking about this confluence of multiple types of organized crime, and as you said, the Cubans also operating at a Key West. Talk a little bit more about that, though, and sort of the forces that were emerging in the early times. I mean, you throughout the book, what I really like about the book is that it is a you're building the layers here, and you're building the house as we get to ultimately the involvement of JFK. There's a lot that happens even before then, even including characters like Hoffa. Um, talk about the trade routes, the emergence of organized crime in Key West, and how that also sort of set the stage for 63.
Yeah. Well, okay, so everybody, the mafia had a lot of control in Cuba before Castro took over. Okay. They were all working with Batista, and the casinos were generating a lot of money, not just for Trafficante and the Tampa Mafia, but for all of the mafia. Meyer Lansky had set things up where it was beneficial to all. And when those casinos were taken away, when Castro stepped in, it was a significant loss of revenue. And that revenue, it needed to be rediscovered. And it was about this time that Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union started pushing their way into Key West. They with the drugs coming in, just like with the liquor, they wanted to control the transportation. They wanted to control the construction. They wanted to control everything in Key West. And what you see happening, there was a guy named Sam Hyman, and he had actually come up from the Philadelphia area, but he ended up being convicted with Jimmy Hoffa over some of the Teamster Fund loans that happened in Key West. And the ones that get the attention, they purchased the La Concha Hotel and the Casa Marina Hotel. These were the biggest hotels on the island. And they probably did this because that was their backup plan was to open up casinos in Key West. But at the same time, they had the Key West Foundation, which developed a racetrack on Stock Island. It developed most of what is now considered Newtown Key West. The Searstown Shopping Plaza, that area. Most of the houses over where Poinciana Plaza is. People who know Key West will know these areas. If you don't know Key West, figure everything outside of Old Town, that was money coming from the Teamsters Fund or from Hoffa to take over. So it was no joke, and they had a real stronghold on the island. And you know, you can imagine how that went.
And let's face it. I mean, like when you live in an area where there may be some organized crime, it can also be beneficial as far as keeping your town safe and keeping your family employed. You just don't ask the wrong questions, and keep it under the radar enough, and hopefully you'll be fine. But uh, there's an element of Key West where there's sort of this community and family element, especially amongst like the conks, the native born. Key West residents. And then do you see the connection between sort of the pride, the territorial kind of element of the conchs, and then the organized crime element? We're talking about two different kinds of family, but very protective, very insular. Do you think that those two kind of pillars uh played off of each other down in Key West? If you know where I'm going with this.
I know where you're going, and a lot of people talk about the Bubba system in Key West, and they say it's like a crony network. They talk about it as a bad thing. Bubba actually derives from brother. And you think of, Key West wasn't always this big tourist mecca where it was easy to start a business and make money. Key West went through hard times. There was a time when they were just going to turn the island over to the federal government and give up because they were bankrupt. So the Navy brought in money. It's been boom or bust. So when you're here and you have a family to take care of, you're going to go where the money is. And I don't think that the conchs were necessarily colluding with the Tampa Mafia. I look at the Tampa Mafia as like this flood that comes in and then the water slowly starts rising. And by the time you're up to you realize that you're up to your neck instead of your ankles, it's too late. So I think that the way that the mafia works, very sneaky. They'll come in, they'll hold things above people's heads. They'll get them to do favors and then say, oh, you did this, it would be a shame to turn you in. They gather evidence on people. And when you have someone struggling to pay their family, well, that's the way they're going to go. And make no mistake, there was a close connection between Key West and Tampa and Cuba. There's like this triangle of trade and of families going back and forth. So when someone who you're friends with or even family with approaches you to do a favor, you're not necessarily in the position to say no. Because do you turn against family? Well, of course not. You try to help them. And I think a lot of the conchs were taken advantage of because of their willingness to help family. And so I really look at the conchs as the victims here. And hey, once you're in the game, you do what you got to do.
I really there's a lot of names to keep up with in the book, and then you kind of talk about, and then they were the brother of so and so, and they were the. I feel like there needs to be an interactive, like a family tree connecting all
Yeah.
of these things that I would like to see online. It's like Game of Thrones in a way.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wait, which guy ran the cement business? Kind
Yeah.
of deal. And so it's fascinating, but these families also there's people that still have family in Key West.
Yep.
So address some of the people that had those connections to what was taking place, in 63 and in the late 50s, early 60s. The people that you spoke to that are living connections to these stories.
Yeah. Well, I think, I started out wanting to write the beach read, the really cool story. But then there's a guy that keeps coming up, in the different CIA reports and the FBI reports, even in other books about the Kennedy assassination. And it's a guy named Gilberto Lopez. And Gilberto Lopez, he's identified as a suspect in the assassination. And the reason that he is a suspect, he has numerous parallels to Lee Harvey Oswald. There's a book out there where they list like 18 things that they both have in common, which are very strange. To me, the most significant is they were both involved in the Fair Play for Cuba committee. But he became a suspect because on the night of the assassination, he crossed the Texas border into Mexico, following the same route that Lee Harvey Oswald had taken just a couple months before. And in Mexico City, he was there for a couple of days, and then he boarded a flight to Cuba where he was the only passenger. And he kind of disappeared. Word intelligence reports came back from Mexico saying he was a suspect in the assassination. But then the FBI and the CIA never provided any information about him to the Warren Commission. And later on, this was reviewed and determined to be very suspicious. So, and he was also in Tampa just a few days before the assassination when President Kennedy was coming through Tampa. So this guy became of great interest to me. And the last he was heard from was in 1964 when he was reported playing dominoes in Cuba. And I looked at his age and I thought, you know what? He'd be old, but he might still be alive. And I decided that I was going to track him down. So I called a friend who's good at connections in Cuba and asked for her help. And she came back and she said, you don't need to go to Cuba. He returned to the United States in 1995. And to me, this was, whoa. How did this guy who's been such a suspect in the Kennedy assassination return to the United States, live under his own name in the heart of the Cuban exile community, and never once get interviewed by journalists, never once be mentioned, never once be questioned by the FBI, the CIA, or anybody investigating the assassination? And it turns out that he had died in 2021. But I tracked down his brother-in-law and was able to talk to him and get some incredible information. And I tracked down his daughter, and she really shared the mother load. I mean, she shared the most incredible information, probably to come out about the Kennedy assassination in the last several decades.
And tease that out a little bit more. I don't want to have you, give away uh the milk for free, but
I don't mind.
this was it you found out that his ex-wife, who he never got divorced from, even though it seemed like he had remarried in Cuba, did speak with Gilberto. I forget what year, but did speak with him shortly before his death or her death, but then
Shortly
also
before.
spoke to his daughter. So kind of tease that out a little bit more and some of the things that you found out through the daughter.
Well, the first person I spoke to was Cookie Machine, and
Right.
Cookie Machine was the brother of Blanche Leon, who was married to Gilberto Lopez. When I spoke with him, I drove up to Tampa to speak with him, and uh, we went to the restaurant there that where Gilberto was supposed to have worked before. It's the Columbia restaurant, and that was supposed to be a Trafficante hangout. And what I was really looking for from Cookie was to confirm any of these mafia connections. And we're sitting outside of the Columbia restaurant, and I'm talking with him, and I said, I said, so tell me what you remember about Gilberto. And he said, well, when he came over on a raft. He was very sick, and my sister nursed him back to health. And uh, I said, how did he act? And he said, well, he was always a little nervous. He was always looking over his shoulder as if he was being followed. He didn't like talking on the telephone. And then Cookies remember things. He goes, and you know what? He didn't like being called by his name. He didn't like using his real name. And he worked at the restaurant there under an assumed name. So I asked Cookie, I said, well, did he ever have guns? And Cookie said, yeah, he tried to bring a duffel bag full of guns into the apartment one day, and my sister wouldn't have any of it. So she told him to get him out of there. And I'm thinking, okay, this is pretty significant, placing guns with this guy who's an suspected assassin. And then I asked Cookie, I said, did he ever mention Dallas? And Cookie kind of looked at me really strange. And he said, yeah. He said, I remember him and my sister getting in a big fight about Dallas. How'd you know that? And I said, well, he's a suspect in the JFK assassination. And Cookie's eyes got wide, and he shows me his arm. He goes, whoa! He goes, look at that! Look at that! The hair in his arms was standing straight up. He had never heard that Gilberto was a suspect. And to me, hearing those stories about the guns, about Dallas, before Cookie even knew there was a connection, that was another moment for me where I'm like, yes, there's something going on here. So that was huge. And then when I talked to the daughter, I didn't I'm not a very good investigative journalist because I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I don't want to dig to places that I shouldn't. One of my things is I have a lot of respect for the people involved because they're all humans. And I'm not here to ruin anybody's name. People who aren't here to talk for themselves, I, I'm very wary about making accusations. So when I reached out to the daughter, it was very important to me that she was comfortable talking. And I was really amazed that she was. And we had several conversations over the course of a month. And she really did fill in 60 years of missing history. You know, um, she shared that her dad had indeed been in Dallas, that he told his family he was in Dallas when Kennedy was assassinated. He never told her that he was involved, but he said, yeah, he was there. And she shared his penchant for violence. She talked about the abuse her and her sister suffered through, her and her mom. And he had a very strict temper. And she also shared about his, he was a diehard communist. And she said that in Cuba, he had fashioned a blackjack out of those thick telephone wires or cables, and that he'd go out and beat anti-Castro Cubans.
Hmm.
So he had this violence, and then they didn't want to leave, or he didn't want to leave Cuba. It took the daughter's mom seeing that he had an American passport or citizenship, and when she saw that, she's like, "Wait, what are we still doing here?" And it took them a couple of years to come back to the United States, but they did. And she talked about the night before they were going to leave, they were visited by what she described as three men in black, that looked just like Men in Black from the movie. And she remembers them warning the family that it might be very dangerous. If they return to the United States, then they might be arrested. They were detained at the airport, and then but they came back and they moved to Hialeah.
And just as a note, so the fair play for Cuba, Batista, we have Castro as a revolutionary. Batista falls, Castro takes over. Initially, there's probably thought that, okay, this would be pretty good for the U.S., but instead, he starts shutting down these U.S. owned businesses, shutting down the casinos, all that good stuff. So then we suddenly we're and not so fond of Castro. The Fair Play for Cuba group was that both Gilberto Lopez and Oswald were a part of. They were they were anti-Castro or they were pro-Castro,
They were pro-Castro.
pro-Castro.
Yeah.
Um, and but there's no evidence that Oswald and Lopez ever actually met.
Well, it's interesting because there was a meeting in Tampa of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and that happened right before Kennedy was passing through Tampa. And there are indications, there's a lot of conflicting information, and you'll find that all over the Kennedy assassination. There is a newspaper report and an interview with Vincent Lee, who was one of the pretty much a founder of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and he says that he met with Oswald around that time in Tampa. So that would place both of them together at the same Fair Play for Cuba Committee meeting. But then you have other people who say no, there's evidence that Oswald was somewhere else. So it's one of those tricky situations, and there's people who will be out there and they'll say that Oswald had doubles. There were other people pretending to be Oswald, in the efforts to set him up as a patsy. They're saying that the person who showed up in Mexico City taking that route that Gilberto Lopez took might not have actually been Oswald. So it's a lot of things that are difficult to prove. One thing, and this is something that I didn't put in the book because I haven't finished investigating it yet. But when Gilberto Lopez came from Cuba, his mom was from Key West, and that's how he was able to come to Key West in 1960. But when he came over, he filled out a passport application, and there are two local references on that passport application. Well, the day that Lee Harvey Oswald traveled from Texas to Mexico and went to the Cuban embassy demanding a visa, um, two other people crossed the Texas border into Mexico City that same day, and they're the same names that are on used as references on Gilberto Lopez's passport.
Yeah, another
So
coincidence, or maybe not.
it, it could be. And, I'm still tracking down birth dates. I'm still looking to confirm that, yes, these are the same two people. Um, but if they are, you know, how much proof do you need? Um, so there's some very intriguing information.
Yeah, even so far as, and you mentioned this, that, uh, well, the Lopez and Oswald, it's not that they look exactly the same, but there's a similar enough appearance that you could interpret, him being a stand-in for Oswald.
Yeah, a lot of people look at them and say, "Wow, they're very strikingly similar." And they're approximately the same age, same height, same build, same weight. Different complexions, uh, but yeah, you could definitely say that.
And Lopez wasn't, and the reason I'm sticking with Lopez is I think this is such an integral character within this book, and your theories really come together in a really interesting way on this. But this wasn't a guy that was a trained soldier, or a guy that would, be a marksman to our knowledge, right? He
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 doesn't appear
spent
to be.
time in Cuba, he came back, and then you write that he was a changed man, but not necessarily trained to be able to carry out this kind of shooting.
Not that we're aware of. We have the report from Cookie about him having guns, and we have reports of him disappearing, for a while, and his wife could never understand how he traveled when he never had any money. So, was he training with the other Cuban exiles at one of the camps on No Name Key? Maybe. Uh, and that's what I'm hoping that the photos that I publish in the book will do. And it's interesting because the National Enquirer or the Globe picked up the story from my book, and they used my information to say that proof that the second shooter was in Dallas. Yes, these pictures.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about this, because these are pretty remarkable photos that we just haven't seen before, and it's a little bit blurry, but we these are the first photos of
Yeah,
Gilberto Lopez, right? This
there was
is
there
entirely
was
new.
one photograph of him, and it was taken in Mexico City at the airport because the CIA, one of the government organizations, they were running a secret program where they were working with Mexican authorities to photograph anybody traveling between Cuba and Mexico. And so the one photograph of him was taken at night, and he's wearing sunglasses. So his face is very much obscured. And you could look at that picture and look at me in sunglasses or you in sunglasses and be, yep, that's the guy. So there were never any known photographs of him. And I went through the files. I found his passport photo. I don't know how I don't know how people missed it for all these years, but more importantly, I talked with his daughter, and she shared photos of him um, from before the assassination, after the assassination, and of him in the United States as an older man. And I think there's people out there who have photos of the training camps, who have photos of Oswald doing other things, who have pictures of Dealey Plaza where there's unidentified people. And I think there's going to come a time when somebody looks at these pictures and says, aha, that's this guy. And Lee Harvey Oswald, he's dead. He was shot shortly after the assassination. So we never get to know that much about him. People will dig into things and try to figure it out. But we have Gilberto Lopez, who has all those parallels, and he lived. He lived long after the assassination. And to me, that gives hope that someone who reads this, someone who sees that photo, knows something, and that they'll come forward. And through that, we'll be able to prove without doubt that there's a conspiracy.
Yeah, when I was growing up, very simplistically, it was okay, Lee Harvey Oswald, the assassin, Jack Ruby, the guy that killed the assassin, and it was only, as I got older that I learned a little bit more about Jack Ruby that okay, this is not some squeaky clean, I mean, not some vigilante just feeling like he was killing an assassin out of some patriotic move. That wasn't so much the case, even though he did get congratulations and telegrams even from Key West saying congrats on
Yeah,
on doing this. But this was a guy that seemed pretty mobbed up himself and wrapped up with all sorts of bad business. Uh, and it also seems through your research and other things that's been out there that Oswald and Ruby, not only at the Key West airport, but seemed like they were occupying the same space a lot of times.
yeah, yeah. That's been reported. There's even reports that they were a couple.
Oh, I didn't know about that one.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff out there about the two of them, and and it's interesting because with with the Tampa Mafia, with the different government organizations, anybody who's involved in something like this, they want plausible deniability.
Hmm.
So whenever you have something happening, it's usually compartmentalized, where the fewest people possible know. But then there's a lot of disinformation put out there because it's known that the more disinformation that's out there, it's more likely that when the truth comes out, people won't believe it. And I think there's a clear case of that happening
Well,
with pretty much everything with JFK.
yeah, I mean, the truth being stranger than fiction, definitely seems like it comes into play, especially in Key West with it's like a murder board that would be just a ball of twine, honestly, because it's everything just feels so tangled and connected. One of the interesting things you talk about, though, present as one of your theories, I believe, I don't think I've seen this anywhere else, is this notion that the reported other assassination attempts on Kennedy in just the days, couple weeks before Dallas, that those weren't necessarily foiled assassination attempts so much as practice runs and stress tests.
Yeah, yeah, and I definitely believe that because if you look around out there, you'll see that there were attempts in Chicago, there were attempts in Miami, and there were attempts in Tampa. And when you look at them, tips were called in. There were every single time. I think that they were just watching to see how everybody responded, so that they could do it just right in Dallas. Because you know what? Uh, People act like it's difficult to kill the president. You look at Kennedy on these tours, there were a lot of people getting very close to him. If they had wanted to take him out at any of those locations, they certainly would have been able to. So I think there were a lot of people watching. A lot of people were observing, and and I think there were more people involved than we realize. Probably on a lot of different fronts, there were different teams set up to assassinate Kennedy. And I imagine Dealey Plaza, and I try not to get too much into that because I mean there could be a million books written about what happened in Dealey Plaza, and people love to argue about different things when I think any of the evidence there can be manipulated. But I kind of imagine that there might have been a dozen shooters. They obviously all didn't fire, but I'm pretty convinced that when those first shots went off, there were a number of people getting ready to pull the trigger who looked around and go, "What the hell?" Uh, and so I think everybody was caught by surprise when that happened.
Like everybody operating on sort of their own orders
Yeah, yeah. I
and
mean, I
whoever got the shot in first.
yeah, I think there would have been a triangulation at least, but um, I suspect there were more people involved who never pulled the trigger, and who just saw it happening and went, "Whoa," and didn't know what to do and just figured they needed to get the hell out of Dodge.
Yeah, and you kind of document how you talk about Kennedy being very exposed on these motorcade trips, and you talk about even in Key West after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he comes down for essentially his victory lap, but there's a lot of pissed off people thinking he either betrayed the Cubans or whiffed at the ability to the opportunity to get rid of Castro, and yet his approval ratings were pretty high at this point. Were higher than they were leading into the Missile Crisis. But you also tell this story of like he's driving through a motorcade. People are very close by. He flips a coin to a kid. I think you. Did you interview this gentleman?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is an intimate affair.
I talked to a lot of people who were there when Kennedy did pass by, and it's amazing how many of them note how surprised they were at how close they were to him, and how many of them said it would have been so easy for me to shoot him.
Yeah, I mean, he went down. Which street was he going down? It was
He went down Truman and then he went on to Duval, and he did a
Duval.
couple of routes. You know, there were the secret motorcades when he went to go inspect the Casa Marina Hotel, which was funny because the Jimmy Hoffa and his associates were renting the Casa Marina out to the military for the Cuban Missile Crisis. So
I'm just thinking about. I don't know how much the geography has changed, but I'm thinking about, let's say, going down Duval Street. You think about Dallas and Dealey Plaza. I'm thinking more wide open avenues. It's pretty contained on most of the roads, honestly, in Key West. So it seems like it'd be pretty close.
yeah, yeah, and everybody was so close. I believe that that's where the thought was. Let's take him out in the motorcade. You know, the headlines just a couple of days before, it was things that would have upset everybody, and I think that's when the mafia all decided, you know what, he's got to go. Um, he's going to be gone by this time next year. I feel like they set that deadline.
So then your idea, your kind of theory about this is mafia and CIA.
Yeah, I think there were people involved on a lot of different levels. I have no doubt in my mind, based on my research, I have no doubt about the mafia being involved. And then with people like Gilberto Lopez, you know, the mafia was actively trying to kill Fidel Castro. And I've uncovered a lot of things, you know, everything with Gilberto Lopez. I think he was operating uh, on behalf of Castro, or at least that's what he thought he was doing.
So,
You know,
so you think Castro was involved?
I think he was, you know, with the Soviets and everything. They say that Kennedy had these deals going on with Khrushchev and they were looking for peace together, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody else was on board with that. And even if Castro was, I think there would be people with Castro. You know, look at this. I mean, we had Kennedy who was for peace, but the CIA, they didn't want that. They wanted their guns and they wanted to take over communist countries. I mean, communism was the enemy. So, what's to say that just because the leader of Cuba felt a certain way, or the leader of the Soviet Union, that there weren't operatives on another level who felt the same way? You know, they weren't fighting the big war or looking for peace. They were enjoying the lives they were living. You know, I mean, and it's interesting because I always look at the characters involved. When I was a kid, I always looked at them as being older people. These were kids. I mean, these were kids out there running the world, and
Yeah.
uh, and it's pretty amazing what they were going through.
Yeah, I mean, and it seemed like a lot of them had a reason to be rid of Kennedy. And you talk about kids, there's the character Morales. You have this picture of him in the book. I can't find it right away, but he looks like a kid, but then you also basically break down the fact that this is a guy that was doing the dirty work and happy to do it. It seemed like
Yeah,
not a nice guy, but also looks like a child based on the photo.
yeah. Yeah, so you had these, I mean, a lot of the Cuban exiles as well. You had these young people coming over and being trained by the CIA on how to
Yeah,
overthrow a country.
yeah,
And yeah, um, yeah, it's interesting. And another thing I find interesting, there's so many people who now take credit for the assassination. And I think there were a lot of people that were involved in some way. But I always find it interesting that, like when I told someone about the book, they said, "Oh no, I have a friend who knows the truth. It was the driver of Kennedy's limo who shot him." And I said, "Ah, Greer. Yeah, he was in Key West. He was a Secret Serviceman for Harry Truman." Um, so almost every name, no
mhm,
matter what conspiracy people throw out, uh, almost all of them have a direct connection to Key West, which which to me I find fascinating. And and that's what I feel, as all these tensions of the world were converging over Key West, it was that live and let live attitude that Key West has always fostered or that developed with the people here. It's all of that being outside of the law. You know, it still feels like that today, but I think that is what allowed the president to be assassinated, allowing all of that to thrive, not just to exist, but to thrive in the Florida Keys.
yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of, I mean, beyond sort of the pirate town element, there's those other kind of factors of, you know, people felt, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, people, this felt like this could be the precipice. This could be the big one, the end of the world, and it would very much end with Key West first, and people stuck in Cuba, people that had fought to overthrow, like, thinking, hey, we're doing all the good work, and then we're left to hang out to dry, like, so a lot of resentment that would build up as a result of that.
Yeah.
Uh, and I want to throw it out to people on the live stream audience if you have questions before I let David go. But because of also your work talking about the paranormal and researching those topics, are there any synchronicities or things that are just so weird that it kind of triggers that paranormal part of your brain where you're just like, man, this is just almost beyond the pale of normal. This is almost like paranormal weirdness level of synchronicity.
It's really strange because I do feel like I was led to Key West for a reason. And like I shared with you, there's a lot of the Robert the Doll stuff that, where I'm convinced now that journey started for me in kindergarten. And it was a 30-year journey that I've just recently kind of figured out. And then I start to look at all of these Kennedy connections. And, I don't think it's a mistake that I grew up in Dallas, very close to that. I don't think it's a mistake that I uncovered what I did here. And I think this journey is just beginning. A lot of people are coming out and starting to talk to me now. I was doing a book signing the other day down at the artisan market, and this another one of the vendors came up and she goes, "Oh, so you probably know about Big Pine." I said, "Oh, I'm familiar with Big Pine." She said, "Oh yeah." She said, "Witness protection program. Nobody there has a last name."
Well,
And I said, "Oh, tell me more." She said, "Wait, someone's at my booth. I'll be back." And she ran off. Uh, but I'm getting people come out of and tell me these stories. Someone else said, totally different person, same day, said, "Oh, I was out on Big Pine. You know about the Kennedy compound there?" And I said, "Well, I know about the Kennedy compound, up in Palm Beach." And he said, "Oh, no, no, no." He said, "I worked for a guy. He, did some window cleaning, and he said that Kennedy had a place in Big Pine, and that's where he used to go down to meet Marilyn Monroe." And that's the second person who told me about, Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe meeting in the Middle Keys. And there's no documentation of this stuff out there, but these stories are starting to surface. And so I think, what we uncovered for the book, pretty significant, as far as Gilberto Lopez is concerned. Um, and the book is, to me, it's a damn good beach read for anybody in Key West, and it's an easy read. I know you talked about how I have a lot of the different names. One of the things I always hated about conspiracy books was they had so many names that connected. So I tried to keep that to a minimum while still explaining what I needed to. But um, I think this book is just the beginning. And I think this journey that I'm on is going to continue to lead to some really fascinating places, just like Robert did. And I don't know what they are, but I think it's going to be a hell of a ride.
Yeah, and I think that the stories that come out of like Marathon and the No Name Key, there's just something about when we know there's not only a lot of military operations, but also the mob operations and then CIA operations. There's already this cloak of secrecy that is cast over the Keys, and
Yeah.
then all kind of coming together in Key West. So I don't know about Big Pine Key, but I can understand why people would go there, would think that, because there's already such clandestine kind of vibes throughout the entire region.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting. Uh, we've just gotten into the UFO tours down here because
Yeah.
as a side project of the Ghosts, I've always been interested in the UFO sightings from around here. And people always said there was an underwater base. Well, in the last year, I started digging more into that and came across all the stuff about Majestic 12, which you probably know. I didn't know anything about. But that all says that Kennedy was killed for uh, threatening to reveal the UFO stuff going on. And every president involved, the Key West Agreement, all of this stuff with the UFOs ties directly to Key West and the surrounding area, Key West, Cuba, all the way over to the Bahamas and Altec. So that to me, if if the UFO stuff ties into the Kennedy assassination in Key West,
Well,
that would be bonkers.
I mean, it's a
But
lot. Like for like, as you said, it is an easy read. It's not overly dense as far as length, and you read through it quickly. And I will even say with the names, it's not complicated. It's not, but it does in the best way. I was thinking Game of Thrones in one level, but then also Godfather 2 was just playing in the back of my head as I was reading this, because of just all these players that are involved and everybody with their own motives, and somewhere in the midst of it all is truth, maybe.
yeah. And
So
it's real interesting. Another thing that's emerged lately, a lot of stuff happens at the Standard Oil docks in Stock Island, and that was owned by the Topinos, who were the construction here. But they were very much against Hoffa trying to take them over. But I noticed that a lot of stuff happens there. I think the Topinos were infiltrated. I know Gilberto Lopez had family who worked for them. I keep finding more even things that indicate they might have been CIA, because the old Havana Key West ferry terminal was a big CIA front. Um, but you lately, all this stuff has emerged about George Bush and Zapata Oil operating out of the Florida Keys around the same time, and there's theories that his oil drilling platforms between the Florida Keys and Cuba were CIA bases, and that he was involved with a lot of this from the beginning too.
there is a cinematic quality to the book, just because of all these characters that are involved, and all the strange bedfellows, the people that are enemies that are still teaming up, to suit their own needs for any given moment. They're still going to remain enemies, but they'll team up for certain things. CIA and mafia. It's juicy. It's juicy stuff. All of it are very historically rooted and documented, but juicy stuff. Before I let you go, I mean, as you said, this story is not done yet for you, and yet I know you have some other book projects going on. So I guess what's sort of the next step or next project you're gonna have out there? You sticking with the JFK history mystery thing, or going back to spooky, or what's up?
I had I had stopped pursuing the Bumfardo story when I started working on the JFK stuff. So I'm going to go back to the Bumfardo story. And hopefully by the middle of this month, February 16th, I think I mentioned is going to be 50 years since he disappeared. So I'm hoping to release the first of two books. This one is Who is Bumfardo, which covers him from his birth up until his disappearance. Um, and then the second book will cover his disappearance till his death.
Where is Bumfardo? Will that one be
Yeah,
called?
yeah,
Oh, is it
where?
actually?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because that's the big question. Everybody has the t-shirts here. But so many people reduce him to a caricature of himself. The flamboyant chief who dressed in red and sold cocaine out of the firehouse and had a penchant for gold. And he was so much more than that. So I've been really doing a deep dive into what he was like as a person because I want to try to capture that because think I think he is very misunderstood. So I want to get the truth out there about him. Of
And and
course,
you run ghost tours out of the firehouse, and
yeah,
any ghost of Bumfardo moving through there?
yeah, and that's actually what got us started doing the ghost tours in there. Some people had investigated and found things, but the guy who lived there, he'd blame Bumfardo when things went wrong. And as soon as he started doing that, something would respond. He had bicycle tires, and one time he goes, Bum, I know you did this. Boom, boom, both of the bicycle tires exploded. He had a friend staying there sleeping on an air mattress, and they kept hearing footsteps. And he said, Bum, would you knock it off? We're trying to sleep. Boom, the air mattress popped. And we've had a lot of people who use spirit boxes, dowsing pendulums, different things to have conversations with the chief. It's one of the more active parts of the firehouse. We have his original desk, a lot of his original uniforms, his plaques, his awards, his trophies, his badges. And I had a kid come down and he said, I was talking to Bum and here's what he said, boom, 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 boom. And I looked at him and I just shook my head. And I'm like, well, I'll be damned. That matches up with what took me 10 years of research to
Hmm.
find out.
Wow.
So I think Bumfardo's there. He was born in 1919, so he'd be what, 100 and something now. So it's a safe bet that he's not out living the good life on a beach in Costa Rica.
Yeah. Well, finally, how can people keep up with you and keep an eye on your other projects?
So for books and stuff and updates on what I'm doing, phantompress.com, kind of like Phantom of the Opera, but phantompress.com. And then Instagram and stuff, David L. Sloan.
All right. Well, David, my buddy, I appreciate you coming and hanging out with us. And I really enjoyed this. And I have to say, like, I'm fascinated by the JFK story, but I'm not a scholar on it. And this is presented in a way that brings you up to speed, but gives you so much more to just a strange, complicated mystery and conspiracy. Um, it's pretty wild stuff in this. So
Yeah.
my my guest, my friend, is David L. Sloan. The new book is How Key West Killed JFK. I'm Aaron Sagers. This has been Talking Strange, and until next time, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.